Ethan Marshall had just parked his aging sedan outside Lily's school when he saw her, a frail, elderly woman struggling to lift a cardboard box from the trunk of her car. "Daddy, why is that lady carrying such a big box?" Lily asked from the back seat, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. Ethan glanced at the dashboard clock. He was already cutting it close for his delivery shift, but something about the woman's hunched shoulders and unsteady grip struck a chord in him. He sighed and turned off the engine. "Stay here, sweetheart. I'll be right back," he said, stepping out of the car. The woman, bundled in a beige cardigan despite the warm morning, looked up as Ethan approached. Her face was lined with years of life, but her expression carried a quiet determination. "Ma'am, let me help you with that," Ethan offered, already reaching for the box. "Oh, thank you, young man," she said with a mixture of relief and hesitation. "I thought I could manage, but it's heavier than I expected." As Ethan hoisted the box, he realized it was packed with old books. "Where do you need this?" he asked, adjusting his grip. "Just inside the front door, if you don't mind." "I'm Eleanor Bennett, by the way," she said, leading the way to a modest but clearly aging house just a few steps away. "Ethan Marshall," he replied. Ethan placed the box in the entryway, careful not to disturb the neatly arranged furniture. The house smelled faintly of lavender and old wood, and the walls were lined with framed photographs. "Thank you so much, Ethan," Mrs. Bennett said, brushing her hands on her cardigan. "I'm trying to sort through some things for donation, but it's slow going these days." Ethan smiled politely, his mind already drifting to the time ticking away on his shift. "Happy to help. If you ever need an extra hand, just let me know." Mrs. Bennett's eyes lit up. "That's very kind of you. I don't want to impose, but if you're sure, do you have a phone number I could call? Just in case?" Ethan hesitated. Between his delivery job, odd carpentry gigs, and raising Lily, his plate was already overflowing. But something about her reminded him of his own grandmother, who had raised him after his parents passed. He scribbled his number on a notepad she handed him. "Call me if you need to, Mrs. Bennett," he said, heading back to the car. As he climbed into the driver's seat, Lily tilted her head. "Why did you help her, Daddy?" Ethan started the car and smiled at her in the rearview mirror. "Because it's the right thing to do, Lil. Sometimes people just need a little help." The next day, as Ethan was finishing a late delivery, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled over to check it and saw an unfamiliar number. "Hello? Ethan? This is Eleanor Bennett. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," he said, though the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. "I hate to trouble you, but I have a cabinet door that's come loose, and my porch light isn't working. I was wondering if you might know how to fix them." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "I can take a look. When would you like me to stop by?" "If you're free tomorrow afternoon, that would be wonderful," she said. He agreed, though a small part of him wondered if he'd regret taking on yet another responsibility. The next day, Ethan showed up at Mrs. Bennett's house, toolbox in hand. Lily had insisted on coming along, so she sat cross-legged on the porch with a coloring book while Ethan worked on the cabinet. "This door just needed a new screw," Ethan said as he tightened the hinge. Mrs. Bennett, sitting nearby with a cup of tea, smiled warmly. "You're quite handy, Ethan. Did you learn that somewhere?" "I used to be an apprentice carpenter," he said without looking up. "Had to quit when Lily was born. Life got complicated." "I see," she said gently. "You're doing a wonderful job raising her." Ethan paused and glanced at Lily, who was humming to herself as she colored. "Thanks. It's not always easy, but she's worth it." By the time he finished replacing the porch light, the sun was starting to set. Mrs. Bennett handed him a plate of cookies wrapped in foil. "For Lily," she said with a wink. "Thank you, Mrs. Bennett," Ethan said, genuinely touched. "Call me Eleanor," she replied. As they walked back to the car, Lily clutched the plate of cookies like a treasure. "Mrs. Bennett is nice," she said. "Yes, she is," Ethan agreed, though he couldn't shake the feeling that she was lonelier than she let on. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, Ethan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Eleanor. "Thank you for helping me today. I'm grateful to have met someone as kind as you." Ethan stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Anytime, Eleanor. Let me know if you need anything else." He set the phone down and exhaled. Life wasn't getting any easier, but helping Eleanor had brought a strange sense of peace. Maybe Lily was right. Mrs. Bennett was nice, and maybe she needed help just as much as he did. By the following weekend, Ethan found himself pulling up to Eleanor Bennett's house once again. It was a warm Saturday afternoon, and Lily skipped happily beside him, holding a small bag of cookies they had baked the night before. They had planned for a quiet day at home, but Eleanor had called the previous evening, sounding hesitant, yet hopeful. Her garden, which she hadn't tended to in years, had become so overgrown it was hardly recognizable. She wondered if Ethan might help her clear it. "I thought we could make it a family project," Ethan had told Lily after hanging up. She had squealed at the idea, excited to be part of something important. Now, standing in front of Eleanor's house, Ethan carried his toolbox and a pair of gardening gloves, while Lily clutched her cookie bag proudly. Eleanor met them at the door, her face lighting up when she saw them. "Oh, Lily, you brought me something?" she asked, crouching slightly to meet the little girl's gaze. "They're cookies," Lily announced. "Daddy helped me bake them." "Well, aren't you two just the sweetest?" "Thank you, dear." Eleanor accepted the bag with a smile and turned to Ethan. "You're too good to me, Ethan. I hope this isn't taking too much of your time." "Not at all," Ethan said, waving off her concern. "It's been a while since I've done any yard work, but I think we can manage." Eleanor led them through the side gate to the backyard, where the garden stretched out in a tangle of weeds, overgrown bushes, and faded flower beds. The remnants of a once beautiful space were still visible. A rusted trellis leaned against the fence, and a stone bird bath sat crookedly amidst the chaos. "I used to spend hours out here," Eleanor said wistfully, her voice tinged with sadness. "My husband and I planted every flower, every shrub. But after he passed, it just became too much," Ethan nodded, understanding the weight behind her words. "We'll get it back in shape," he said firmly. "Lily and I will work together." "Right, kiddo? Right," Lily chirped, already pulling on a pair of child-sized gardening gloves. For the next few hours, they worked side by side. Ethan tackled the larger tasks, like trimming back the overgrown bushes and pulling out stubborn weeds, while Lily focused on smaller jobs, like collecting fallen twigs and watering the surviving plants. Eleanor stayed nearby, offering them cold lemonade and sharing stories about the garden's past. "That trellis over there," she said, pointing, "used to be covered in climbing roses. Charles, my husband, built it himself. It looked so beautiful in the spring." Ethan glanced at the trellis and made a mental note to repair it if he had time. He could see how much this garden had meant to her, and he wanted to bring at least a piece of it back to life. By late afternoon, the garden was beginning to take shape. The flower beds were cleared, the bushes trimmed, and the bird bath straightened. Lily had even discovered a small patch of wildflowers still blooming near the fence. "Look, Mrs. Bennett," she called excitedly, holding up a handful of daisies she had picked. "These are still pretty." Eleanor's eyes softened as she took the daisies from Lily. "They are pretty, aren't they?" "Thank you, Lily." As they wrapped up for the day, Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed their progress. "It's not perfect, but it's a start," he said. "It's more than I could have hoped for," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan. And thank you, Lily. You've brought a bit of life back to this place." Ethan smiled, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't often that he had the chance to do something meaningful like this, and seeing Eleanor's gratitude made it all worth it. Before they left, Eleanor pulled Ethan aside. "I'd like to pay you for your time," she said, reaching for her purse. Ethan shook his head. "Eleanor, you don't need to do that. We were happy to help." "But you've done so much," she insisted. "It doesn't feel right not to give you something." "Your cookies and lemonade were payment enough," he said with a grin. "Besides, I think Lily enjoyed this more than I did." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "Well, if you ever need anything, a meal, a break, anything at all, you know where to find me." "I'll keep that in mind," Ethan said, touched by her offer. As they drove home, Lily chattered excitedly about the garden and how much fun she had. Ethan listened with a smile, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He wondered how Eleanor managed to keep such a warm spirit despite the loneliness she must feel. And he couldn't help but think about his own struggles, his mounting bills, his worn-out car, and the weight of being a single parent. But for now, those worries felt a little lighter. Helping Eleanor had reminded him that even small acts of kindness could make a big difference. That evening, as Ethan tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with a serious expression. "Daddy, can we help Mrs. Bennett again? I think she's lonely. And her garden still needs more flowers." Ethan kissed her forehead. "We'll see, sweetheart, but you're right, she is lonely, and I think we can help with that." Lily smiled and closed her eyes, quickly drifting off to sleep. Ethan sat beside her for a moment, thinking about her words. Maybe this was more than just a neighborly favor. Maybe he and Eleanor were helping each other in ways neither of them fully realized yet. 5 days after their first big day in Eleanor's garden, Ethan was back at her house. This time, Lily had insisted they bring a bag of sunflower seeds to plant. "They'll make her garden smile," she had said, and Ethan couldn't argue with that logic. Eleanor greeted them warmly, and they quickly got to work. The garden, while still a shadow of its former glory, was beginning to look less like a jungle and more like a place someone might sit and enjoy the sunshine. Eleanor brought out a folding chair and sat under the shade of the large oak tree at the edge of the yard. Watching Ethan and Lily work, she smiled to herself, though her expression occasionally turned pensive, as though she were lost in thought. "Lily, you're becoming quite the gardener," she said, as Lily carefully dug a shallow hole for the sunflower seeds. "Daddy says I'm his little helper," Lily replied proudly, brushing a streak of dirt across her cheek. Eleanor chuckled. "Well, you're certainly that, and a very good one too." Ethan glanced up from where he was repairing the old trellis, which he had promised himself he'd fix. "She's the best," he said. "I don't know what I'd do without her." Eleanor's smile softened. "It's clear how much you love her. You're a good father, Ethan." He gave a modest shrug, focusing on the trellis. "I try. Some days are harder than others, but she keeps me going." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then said, "You know, Ethan, you remind me a lot of my Charles. He was always the first to offer a helping hand, never expecting anything in return. He believed in doing good for the sake of it." She paused, her voice growing quieter. "You don't see that as much these days." Ethan didn't know what to say to that, so he simply nodded. He wasn't used to being compared to anyone, let alone someone Eleanor clearly held in such high regard. By late afternoon, the garden was transformed. The trellis stood upright, freshly secured, and ready for climbing plants. The flower beds were clear and freshly turned, and Lily's sunflower seeds were nestled safely in their new home. Eleanor looked around, her hands clasped together as though she might cry. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Ethan said, brushing dirt off his hands. "We're happy to help." Eleanor shook her head. "You've done more than help. You've brought life back to something I thought I'd lost forever." As they packed up their tools, Eleanor disappeared into the house for a moment and returned with a tin of cookies she had baked earlier that morning. "For you and Lily," she said. "It's not much, but it's something." "Thank you," Ethan said, taking the tin. "You didn't have to do that." "It's the least I can do," she replied. "And Ethan, if you ever need anything at all, you just let me know." He nodded, though he doubted he'd ever take her up on the offer. He wasn't the type to ask for help, no matter how much he might need it. The next week, Ethan was sitting at his kitchen table, surrounded by a mess of bills and overdue notices. The stress was starting to wear on him. The delivery job barely covered their basic expenses, and the odd carpentry jobs, while helpful, were too sporadic to make a real difference. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and glanced at the clock. It was almost time to pick Lily up from school. Just as he stood to grab his keys, there was a knock at the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, he considered ignoring it. But the knock came again, more insistent this time. He opened the door to find Eleanor standing there, a manila envelope in her hand. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she said, smiling. "I just wanted to drop this off." She handed him the envelope, and he took it, confused. "What is it?" "Open it," she said simply. Ethan hesitated, then slid his finger under the flap and pulled out a check. His eyes widened as he read the amount. $10,000. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He looked up at Eleanor, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find the words. "I can't accept this," he finally said, shaking his head. "It's too much." "It's not," Eleanor said firmly. "Ethan, I've been thinking about this for a while. You've done so much for me, more than you realize, and I know how hard you're working to give Lily a good life. This is my way of saying thank you. But I didn't do any of this expecting money," he said. "I just wanted to help." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "And that's exactly why you deserve it." She placed a hand on his arm. "Ethan, I'm not giving this to you out of pity. I'm giving it to you because I believe in you. You have a kind heart, and I want to see you succeed." Ethan swallowed hard, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll use it," she said with a small smile. "Pay off some bills, fix your car, maybe even take a day off once in a while." He nodded slowly, still trying to process what was happening. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you so much." Eleanor patted his arm. "You're very welcome, and remember, if you ever need anything else, you know where to find me." As she turned to leave, Ethan called out to her. "Eleanor?" She stopped and looked back. "I don't know how to repay you for this." "You already have," she said, simply, and with that, she walked down the path and disappeared around the corner. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long moment, the check still in his hand. He thought about all the times he had worried about how he would make ends meet, about all the sacrifices he had made for Lily. And now, because of Eleanor, things might finally start to change. When he picked Lily up from school later that day, she noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Daddy, why are you smiling so much?" she asked as she climbed into the car. "Because, sweetheart," he said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Sometimes good things happen when you least expect them." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. 2 weeks had passed since Eleanor had shown up at Ethan's door with the check. The initial shock of her generosity had settled into a quiet determination on his part. Ethan had spent days combing through his bills, carefully allocating the money to pay off the most urgent debts. The rent was finally caught up, his car loan was no longer in arrears, and he had even managed to schedule a service appointment to fix the sputtering engine and broken air conditioner. For the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. It was a Saturday morning when Ethan stood in the driveway, wiping his hands on a rag after changing the oil in his car. The air carried the crisp promise of autumn, and Lily was sitting nearby on the front steps, her coloring book balanced on her knees. "Daddy, are we going to see Mrs. Bennett today?" she asked, not looking up as she carefully shaded in the petals of a flower. Ethan smiled at her question. They had started visiting Eleanor regularly since the garden project, and Lily had grown quite attached to her. "We are," he said. "After lunch, we'll head over. I want to see how those sunflowers you planted are doing." Lily grinned, her excitement bubbling over. "Do you think they've grown tall yet? I bet they're taller than me now." "We'll see," Ethan replied, chuckling. He glanced at his watch. "Finish up your picture, and we'll get going." By early afternoon, Ethan and Lily were pulling up to Eleanor's house. As they got out of the car, they noticed her standing on the porch, a watering can in her hand. She waved at them, her face lighting up as they approached. "Ethan, Lily, what a nice surprise," she said, setting the watering can down. "The garden's been missing its little helper." Lily ran up to her, giving her a quick hug. "I came to check on my sunflowers. Are they big yet?" "They certainly are," Eleanor said, leading them around to the backyard. "Why don't you take a look?" Lily dashed ahead, her laughter trailing behind her. Ethan and Eleanor followed at a slower pace, and as they rounded the corner, Ethan couldn't help but smile. The garden looked vibrant and alive, a stark contrast to the overgrown mess it had been just weeks before. The sunflowers stood tall and proud in the corner, their golden petals reaching toward the sky. "You've been keeping it up," Ethan said, glancing at Eleanor. "It looks amazing." "Well, I've had some help," she replied with a small smile. "Your little one's enthusiasm is contagious. I find myself looking forward to coming out here every day." They reached the sunflowers, where Lily was already examining them closely. "Daddy, they're as tall as you," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. "Almost," Ethan said, crouching down beside her. "You did a good job, kiddo." Eleanor watched them with a warm expression. "You've got a special one there, Ethan. She's got a heart as big as those sunflowers." "Thanks," Ethan said, standing up. "She's my whole world." For the next hour, they worked together in the garden, weeding, pruning, and adding a fresh layer of mulch to the flower beds. Lily chattered non-stop, talking about her school projects, her favorite books, and how she wanted to plant even more flowers next spring. Eleanor listened intently, her laughter ringing out every so often as Lily's stories grew more animated. As the afternoon wore on, they all sat down under the shade of the oak tree, sipping lemonade that Eleanor had brought out. Lily was busy, sketching flowers in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Ethan," Eleanor said after a moment, her tone thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask, what are your plans now?" "Plans?" he asked, setting his glass down. "Yes," she said gently. "I know you've used some of the money to take care of immediate needs. But have you thought about what's next?" Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I've been thinking about going back to carpentry," he admitted. "It's what I loved doing before Lily was born, and I think I could make a decent living at it if I built up enough clients." Eleanor nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I think that's a wonderful idea. You're clearly talented, Ethan. I could see it in the way you fixed that trellis and made this garden look like home again. It's just, starting over is scary," he said, his voice quieter now. "I've been in survival mode for so long that thinking about the future feels overwhelming." "I understand," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "But you've already taken the first steps. You're resourceful and you have the drive. The rest will come with time." Ethan looked at her, her words sinking in. She made it sound so simple, So possible. Maybe she was right. Maybe he could start over, rebuild his life in a way that wasn't just about getting by. Before they left that evening, Eleanor handed Ethan a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just a little something to help you get started," she said with a smile. "Don't open it until you get home." He wanted to refuse, but the look in her eyes stopped him. She wasn't offering out of pity, she truly believed in him. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. When they got home later that evening, Ethan opened the envelope and found a short note tucked inside. It read, "For tools, materials, or whatever you need to start building again. I believe in you, Ethan." Along with the note was a gift card to a local hardware store, enough to purchase everything he'd need to get back on his feet. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the note. He felt a swell of gratitude that he couldn't put into words. Eleanor's faith in him wasn't just about the money or the gift card, it was about the way she saw him. Not as someone struggling, but as someone capable of so much more. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Daddy, are we going to plant more flowers with Mrs. Bennett?" "Maybe," he said, brushing her hair back. "But first, I've got some building to do." "Like what?" she asked, yawning. "Like our future," he said softly. And for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to start.